Hi, the SI meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Monday afternoon, January 14th. We've gone through a mild spell here in the Mid-Atlantic region. A cold front has slipped through the region this morning, and colder air will slowly filter into the region over the next couple of days. Nothing outrageous at all, only a moderately chilly air mass, more seasonal compared to what it's been for the last week or so. Another cold front will bring even colder air late Thursday night into Friday. But even that air mass will tend to relax a little bit over the weekend. But big changes are coming early next week. The western two-thirds of the nation have been quite cold over the last few days. And in fact, much of the globe has been quite cold. China's been experiencing one of its worst winters in the last 3 decades. There's been a rare snowstorm in the Middle East. And it's been quite cold throughout other parts of Europe and Asia, including India and all the way to Eastern Europe. And it looks like the central and eastern U.S. will finally get their share beginning early part of next week. In fact, the pattern change appears to be quite dramatic, and it looks like not only one impressive Arctic outbreak early next week, but that may very well be followed by another couple of air masses during the latter part of the month of January. One of the culprits causing this potential big change in the temperature pattern here in the central and eastern U.S., of course, is this major stratospheric warming event that has taken place over the last week or so. We have, in fact, been talking about this for a couple of weeks now. This is a 30-day loop way up in the atmosphere, 10 millibars, which is way at the top of the atmosphere in the stratosphere around the world. Notice here, towards the latter part of December, just kind of an explosion of temperatures, first over Asia, then it kind of expanded all the way up towards the North Polar region, and even in the last couple of frames, you can kind of see a little breakout of stratospheric warming right here over the eastern part of the U.S. So this stratospheric warming event is continuing right now, and it's indeed having an effect on global patterns that looks like it'll lead to a much colder pattern here in the eastern U.S. come the early part of next week. Well, here's another way to look at this dramatic stratospheric warming event that was rather sudden. And this is a temperature plot at 10 millibars, once again, way up in the high part of the atmosphere over the northern latitudes. This actually goes from 65 degrees north to 90 degrees north, the actual polar region. And here's just a spike in temperatures in the stratosphere just in a quick week or 10 days or so here. And again, this is all a part of this stratospheric warming event that indeed is changing the global patterns around the world that look like it'll lead to much colder weather here starting early part of next week. Now, over the past couple of decades, we've had some major stratospheric warming events that indeed caused dramatic turnarounds, and we highlight a couple of them on our Meteorology 101 section with the stratospheric warming video. There was one, for example, that started off with the warming event during December of 1984, and then January of 1985 turned out to be a very cold month in much of the central and eastern U.S. Same sort of thing happened December of 1998 to January of 1999. A couple of historic stratospheric warming events, and indeed this one looks like a major one, perhaps in the right up there with those couple earlier in the last few decades. But here's another way to look at this stratospheric warming event. And normally we have a polar vortex, basically a cold blob in the upper part of the atmosphere sitting over the North Pole. And right here, this little circle right here represents where the North Pole is. We're looking down on the pole here. And notice what's happened here. That normal single entity polar vortex has split into two. There's one section right here and one section right here. They've kind of weakened and split into two as this stratospheric warming event moved over the pole from the Asian side of the pole over the last week to 10 days. Now, one of the interesting things about this particular 10 millibar temperature analysis is it doesn't change a heck of a lot. Here's the forecast for 5 days from now. Still a split in the polar vortex right here. And then another 5 days, which is 10 days from now. Same sort of result here with a split in the polar vortex. So we really go from this currently to this in 5 days and this in 10 days. Not a heck of a lot of a change there. The polar vortex has weakened and split into two, and it looks like it'll remain that way for the next 5 or 10 days. Well, exactly what kind of effect did this stratospheric warming event had? And of course, it's not the only factor. There are many other factors involved. In fact, we talked earlier about a widespread snowpack throughout the northern hemisphere that kind of led to the belief that some cold air will redevelop after this mild spell here in the central and eastern U.S. But this is the upper air pattern forecast by last night's GFS model for about a week from now, a week to 10 days from now. And it's for the 500 millibars, which is about the middle part of the atmosphere, about 18,000 feet up in the air. And there's quite a few things here to point out that really lead to cold temperatures here in the central and eastern U.S. in about a week's time or so. First of all, a very cold height anomaly here sitting right over the northeastern part of the U.S., really centered over the Great Lakes. This is where some of the coldest air in the entire northern hemisphere looks like it'll be situated right here. Again, these are 500 millibar height anomalies. You have quite a ridge right up and down the west coast. And what this tends to do is bring cold air down from the polar region right into the central and eastern U.S. In fact, right here is the North Pole indicated by this particular map. And winds blow really parallel to these lines here, so you can envision the trajectory of the wind coming right from the North Pole in a week's time into the central and ultimately the eastern part of the U.S. So that kind of a height anomaly chart is really indicative of some potential very cold air into the central and eastern part of the U.S. come a week's time or so, the early part of next week. Another thing, we've had a ridge over the southeastern part of the country for the last month or so. In fact, all of last winter we had this southeastern ridge, which is kind of typical with a La Nina weather pattern, sea surface temperature pattern over the Pacific. But notice that has completely flattened down, broken down, and maybe moved off into the central Atlantic. So the southeastern ridge is virtually gone. A tremendous cold pool of air in the upper atmosphere sitting right over the northeastern part of the country, centered over the Great Lakes. A ridge along the west coast. About the only thing missing from this is kind of a real significant block over Greenland, which you sometimes see, and that locks in the cold air. But I think what will happen is we'll have one very impressive cold air outbreak early next week, but that may relax a little bit before yet another one, and perhaps another one follow during the latter part of the month of January. And I notice here a couple other big blobs of cold air, and indeed there'll be some cold weather in parts of Europe and Asia at the same time the central and eastern U.S. goes into the deep freeze next week. Well, one last bit of charts that I'd like to show just to kind of emphasize the changes that are coming here in the eastern U.S. These come from RaleighWeather.com, and we're going to look at the 850 millibars. This is the lowest part of the atmosphere, the temperature anomalies, departures from normal. This will be the days 1 through 5. Then we'll look at days 6 to 10, and then beyond that, days 11 to 15, from the very latest, a 12Z GFS ensemble run. So here we have the greens. That indicates above normal temperatures right here. And in fact, that's partially a result of what's going on today. But over the next 5 days, it'll average out a little bit above normal here in the eastern states. Where it's blue, light blues, all the way to dark blues is where the colder pattern is developing. And over the next 5 days, that includes today, it'll be confined to Canada. But now let's take a look at the next 5-day period, which will be days 6 to 10 from right now. And here you go, quite a difference. This is a complete reversal real here in the eastern states with lots of blues up and down the east coast, and really the center of this real cold change will be over the upper part of the Midwest and northern plains. We're right in this region right here. Again, this is days 6 to 10, basically stretching from the early part of next week into the middle part of next week. Quite a reversal, quite a widespread change here, all the way down into the deep south. And again, I think this particular cold wave could set up shop all the way from the northern plains down to perhaps as far south and east as Florida, and certainly the I-95 corridor will be caught in the grips of this change to a much colder pattern early next week. Well, what about beyond that? Well, let's now jump ahead to days 11 to 15, and not quite as cold, but still pretty impressive cold air situated across the northern tier of the nation. All of this is days 11 to 15 from now. So even though it may not be quite as dramatically cold as it will be early to middle part of next week, it's still well below normal, and there are signs for additional impressive cold air Arctic outbreaks beyond the one that starts this change in the pattern early next week. So we'll continue to follow all of this here at the SIweather.com, but big changes are coming for the central and eastern U.S., especially beginning the early part of next week in terms of temperatures, with the potential for some frigid air masses. That's it for now. I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.